The morning sun cast a gentle glow through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood quietly in her private study. Her fingers traced the edges of a handwritten letter that had arrived just hours before. The royal household buzzed with its usual activity, but something felt different today. Staff members moved with a more measured pace, their conversations hushed and respectful. William entered the room, his footsteps soft on the Persian carpet. He had just finished a phone call that would change everything they had planned for the coming months. The couple exchanged a knowing glance, the kind that comes from years of partnership through both triumph and adversity. They had received news that would require them to step away from their public duties for a brief but meaningful period. The letter Catherine held contained an invitation that touched their hearts deeply. An elderly woman named Margaret from a small village in Wales had written to them months ago, sharing her story of loss and hope. Her late husband had been a devoted supporter of the royal family, and she had always dreamed of hosting them for tea in her modest cottage garden. What made this invitation special was that Margaret had recently been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and her family had reached out through proper channels. Hoping against hope, Catherine looked up at William, her eyes reflecting the weight of the decision they needed to make. Their official calendar was packed with state functions, charity galas, and diplomatic meetings. Stepping away, even briefly, would require careful coordination and would certainly draw media attention. Yet something about Margaret's simple request spoke to the very heart of why they served. William moved to the window, watching their children play in the garden below. George was teaching Charlotte how to properly kick a football, while little Louis chased after them with infectious laughter. The scene reminded him of his own childhood, of the lessons his mother had taught him about connecting with people beyond the palace walls. Diana had always believed that the most important royal duties happened away from cameras and crowds. The couple had built their marriage and their roles around the principle of authentic service. They had visited countless hospitals, schools, and community centers, but those visits were always accompanied by security details, photographers, and carefully planned itineraries. Margaret's invitation offered something different entirely, a chance to simply be present with someone who needed comfort, without fanfare or formality. Catherine set the letter down on her desk and walked over to join William at the window. They watched as their protection officers maintained their discreet distance while the children played. Even in these private moments, their lives were carefully orchestrated and observed. The idea of stepping away from this structured existence, even temporarily, felt both liberating and daunting. Their private secretary had already outlined the complications such a visit would entail. Security protocols would need to be established, the media would need to be managed, and their other commitments would need to be rescheduled. Yet as they stood together in the quiet morning light, both William and Catherine felt a pull toward something more meaningful than their official obligations. William reached for Catherine's hand, a gesture that had become their silent way of confirming they were in agreement. They had learned over the years that their most impactful moments often came not from grand gestures, but from small acts of genuine care. The decision they were contemplating would require them to trust in something deeper than duty, something that connected them to the very essence of service. The palace around them held centuries of history, traditions, and expectations. Yet in this moment, they were simply a husband and wife trying to determine how they could best use their position to bring comfort to someone in need. Margaret's letter had reminded them that behind every royal engagement were real people with real stories, and sometimes the most important thing they could offer was simply their presence and their time. 3 days later, William and Catherine found themselves in an unmarked car driving through the Welsh countryside. They had made their decision during a quiet dinner the previous evening, after tucking their children into bed and stealing a few moments alone. The media had been told they were taking a brief private break for family time, which was true enough. Though the full story remained their secret, their driver, Thomas, had been with the royal household for over 15 years and understood the delicate nature of this journey. He had helped arrange similar quiet visits before, understanding that sometimes the most important royal work happened away from public view. The car moved steadily through rolling hills dotted with sheep, past stone walls that had stood for generations, toward a village that few people could find on a map. Catherine watched the landscape change through the window, feeling a sense of anticipation she had not experienced in months. Their official duties, while meaningful, often felt choreographed and predictable. Every handshake was timed, every conversation planned, every photograph calculated for maximum positive impact. This journey felt different, more human somehow, stripped of the usual protocols that governed their lives. William studied the briefing notes their private secretary had prepared about Margaret and her family. At 87, she had lived through extraordinary changes in Britain. She had worked as a schoolteacher for 40 years, had raised 3 children, and had been married to her husband Robert for 62 years before his passing 6 months ago. Her letter to them had been written in careful cursive handwriting, each word chosen with thought and care. The village of Llanfairpwll appeared gradually, first as a church spire visible over a hill, then as a collection of stone cottages nestled in a valley. The car slowed as they entered the narrow main street, past a small post office that doubled as a general store, a pub called the Red Dragon, and houses with gardens full of late summer flowers. Thomas consulted his notes and turned down a lane that seemed barely wide enough for their vehicle. Margaret's cottage sat at the end of the lane, surrounded by a garden that clearly received loving attention. Roses climbed the walls, and a variety of flowers created splashes of color against the gray stone. A small greenhouse stood in one corner, and a wooden bench faced the mountains in the distance. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, and lace curtains hung in the windows, giving the place a welcoming, lived-in feeling. As their car came to a stop, Catherine felt her heart rate increase slightly. This was unlike any royal visit she had ever undertaken. There would be no receiving line, no formal presentations, no carefully rehearsed conversations. She and William would simply be guests in an elderly woman's home, offering whatever comfort and companionship they could provide during a difficult time. Margaret appeared at her front door before they had even stepped out of the car. She was smaller than Catherine had imagined, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a blue cardigan that looked hand-knitted. Her face showed the effects of illness, but her eyes were bright and alert. She leaned heavily on a walking stick, but her smile was radiant as she watched the couple approach her gate. William opened the car door for Catherine, and together they walked up the short path to Margaret's door. The elderly woman's hand shook slightly as she reached out to greet them, and Catherine immediately stepped forward to take both of Margaret's hands in hers. The gesture was instinctive, natural, without any of the formal protocol that usually governed royal greetings. Margaret's voice was soft but clear as she welcomed them into her home. The cottage was exactly what Catherine had hoped it would be, filled with photographs, comfortable furniture, and the accumulated treasures of a long and well-lived life. The smell of fresh baking filled the air, and sunlight streamed through windows that looked out over the garden where Margaret had clearly spent countless happy hours. William noticed immediately how Margaret's face lit up when she spoke about her late husband Robert. The cottage was filled with evidence of their shared life together, from wedding photographs to travel souvenirs to books they had clearly read together. As Margaret led them into her sitting room, both William and Catherine realized they were witnessing something precious, the home of 2 people who had built a beautiful life together through simple devotion and daily kindness. Margaret's sitting room told the story of a remarkable marriage through carefully preserved memories. Photographs covered nearly every surface, showing a young couple on their wedding day in 1960, family holidays by the seaside, grandchildren taking their first steps, and countless moments of everyday joy. Catherine found herself drawn to a particular photograph showing Margaret and Robert dancing at what appeared to be their golden wedding anniversary celebration. The elderly woman noticed Catherine's interest and moved slowly toward the photograph, her walking stick tapping gently on the wooden floor. Her eyes grew distant as she began to share the story behind the image. Robert had surprised her with a renewal of their wedding vows for their 50th anniversary, organizing the entire celebration in secret with help from their children and grandchildren. They had danced to the same song they had chosen for their first dance as newlyweds. "The Way You Look Tonight." William settled into an armchair that clearly had been Robert's favorite spot, evidenced by the slight depression in the cushion and the reading glasses that still sat on the side table. Margaret had prepared tea using her finest china, the set she had received as a wedding gift and had saved for special occasions throughout her marriage. The cups were delicate and beautiful, painted with tiny roses that matched the ones climbing outside her windows. As Margaret poured the tea, her hands trembled slightly and Catherine instinctively reached out to help steady the teapot. The gesture was natural and unthinking, the kind of help one might offer to any elderly relative. Margaret's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, not because she was being helped by royalty, but because someone had noticed her need and responded with kindness. The conversation that followed was unlike any the royal couple had experienced during their years of public service. Margaret spoke about her diagnosis with remarkable acceptance and grace, explaining that she had chosen to face her illness at home, surrounded by the memories she and Robert had created together. She talked about their children, who visited regularly but lived far away, and about the garden that had been her sanctuary since Robert's passing. William found himself sharing stories about his own grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, and the lessons she had taught him about finding strength in difficult times. He spoke about the importance of routine and familiar surroundings during periods of grief, observations that seemed to resonate deeply with Margaret. She nodded knowingly as he described how his grandmother had found comfort in her daily walks and her correspondence with friends around the world. Catherine asked Margaret about her years as a teacher, and the elderly woman's entire demeanor changed as she began sharing stories about her former students. She had taught primary school children for 4 decades, and many of them still sent her Christmas cards and visited when they returned to the village with their own families. Her small cottage was filled with handmade gifts from students, including pottery, drawings, and a quilt made by parents as a retirement present. The afternoon sun streamed through Margaret's windows as she led them to her kitchen, where she had prepared a simple but delicious meal. The kitchen was the heart of the cottage, with copper pots hanging from hooks, herbs growing on the windowsill, and a well-worn recipe book that had belonged to her mother. She explained that cooking had always been one of her greatest pleasures, and she had continued preparing meals for one since Robert's death, finding comfort in the familiar rituals. During lunch, Margaret shared more intimate details about her marriage and her current struggles. She spoke honestly about the loneliness that followed Robert's death, about waking each morning and momentarily forgetting he was gone, about the challenges of managing household tasks that they had always shared. Yet she also spoke about gratitude, about the blessing of having loved so deeply and been loved in return. William and Catherine found themselves deeply moved by Margaret's wisdom and resilience. She possessed a kind of strength that had nothing to do with titles or positions, everything to do with a life lived with integrity and purpose. Her small cottage contained more genuine nobility than many palaces they had visited, and her simple acceptance of life's joys and sorrows offered lessons they knew they would carry with them long after this visit ended. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret insisted on showing them her garden, the place where she felt closest to Robert's memory. She had continued tending the flowers and vegetables they had planted together, finding peace in the cycles of growth and renewal that surrounded her home. The garden was clearly her masterpiece, a living testament to decades of patient care and attention. Margaret's garden was a masterpiece of color and careful planning, with flowers arranged in a way that ensured something would be blooming from early spring through late autumn. She explained that Robert had designed the layout during their first year in the cottage, drawing detailed sketches of where each plant should go, and researching which varieties would thrive in Welsh soil and climate. Together they had spent countless evenings working side by side, planting bulbs, tending seedlings, and watching their vision slowly come to life. Catherine knelt beside a bed of late-blooming roses, breathing in their fragrance and marveling at their perfect condition, despite Margaret's advancing age and declining health. The elderly woman explained that maintaining the garden had become her way of staying close to Robert's memory. Each morning, weather permitting, she would spend at least an hour among the flowers, talking to them and to Robert as if he were still there beside her. William was particularly drawn to a small greenhouse where Margaret grew tomatoes and herbs. She had continued Robert's tradition of starting plants from seed each spring, carefully nurturing them through the unpredictable Welsh weather until they were strong enough to transplant outside. The greenhouse smelled of earth and growing things, and Margaret's tools hung neatly on hooks where Robert had placed them years before. As they walked through the garden, Margaret pointed out plants that held special significance, a climbing rose that had been a wedding gift from Robert's mother, now covering most of one wall. A small apple tree they had planted when their first grandchild was born, still producing fruit 25 years later. A patch of wildflowers that had self-seeded from a bouquet Robert had picked for her during one of their early walks in the countryside. The couple learned that Margaret had been documenting the garden through photographs and pressed flowers, creating a record that she planned to leave for her children and grandchildren. She showed them albums filled with pictures taken throughout the seasons, capturing the garden's transformation from the stark beauty of winter through the explosion of color in summer. Each photograph was carefully labeled with dates and notes about weather conditions or special events. Catherine found herself thinking about her own children and the gardens at their various homes. She realized that George, Charlotte, and Louis had access to magnificent formal gardens maintained by professional staff, but they had never experienced the intimate joy of planting seeds with their parents and watching them grow over time. Margaret's garden represented something different, a living legacy created through daily attention and care, rather than grand design and unlimited resources. Margaret led them to a wooden bench positioned to overlook the entire garden and the mountains beyond. This had been her and Robert's favorite spot for their evening tea during good weather, the place where they had made countless decisions about household matters and shared their dreams for the future. The bench showed signs of decades of use, its wood worn smooth by countless hours of occupation. As they sat together on the bench, Margaret began sharing more personal aspects of her current situation. She spoke about her decision to refuse aggressive medical treatments, choosing instead to focus on quality of life during her remaining time. Her children had initially struggled with this choice, but she had helped them understand that she wanted to die in the home she had shared with Robert, surrounded by the things that had given her life meaning. William was struck by Margaret's remarkable clarity about her priorities and her complete lack of self-pity despite her circumstances. She had arranged for her most precious possessions to be distributed among family members, had updated her will with careful consideration for each recipient, and had even written letters to be opened after her death. Yet she spoke about these preparations matter-of-factly, as practical matters rather than morbid preoccupations. The conversation gradually shifted to Margaret's hopes for her children and grandchildren. She worried about her youngest son, who had struggled with depression since his father's death. She was proud of her daughter, who had become a successful nurse while raising 3 children. She delighted in stories about her grandchildren's achievements at school and their various interests and talents. Catherine realized that Margaret's concerns were universal, the same worries and joys that any parent or grandparent might experience. Despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together, this visit had become a reminder that the most important human experiences transcend social class or royal titles. Love, loss, hope, and family relationships form the foundation of meaningful life, regardless of one's circumstances. As the afternoon light began to fade, Margaret insisted on cutting flowers for Catherine to take home to her children. She moved carefully through her garden, selecting blooms that would travel well and last for several days. Each flower was chosen with thought and care, and she wrapped them in damp paper towels and beautiful tissue paper that she had been saving for a special occasion. As evening approached, Margaret invited William and Catherine back inside for what she called proper dinner, insisting that their afternoon tea had been insufficient for guests who had traveled so far to see her. The kitchen filled with wonderful aromas as she prepared a traditional Welsh meal, using vegetables from her garden and recipes that had been passed down through generations of her family. Despite her illness, she moved around her kitchen with practiced efficiency, clearly finding joy in the act of cooking for others. Catherine offered to help with the preparations, but Margaret gently declined, explaining that cooking for guests had always been one of her greatest pleasures. Instead, she asked Catherine to set the table using her grandmother's china and silver, pieces that had survived 2 world wars and countless family celebrations. Each item had a story, from the serving platter that had held Christmas puddings for decades to the crystal glasses that had been wedding gifts nearly 90 years before. While Margaret cooked, William explored the cottage more thoroughly, drawn to a small study that had clearly been Robert's domain. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with volumes on history, gardening, and Welsh literature. A desk sat beneath the window, still arranged exactly as Robert had left it, with his reading glasses folded beside a half-finished crossword puzzle and a stack of letters from old friends that Margaret had been unable to bring herself to move. The dinner conversation revealed more about Margaret's remarkable perspective on life and death. She spoke about her faith, not in terms of rigid doctrine, but as a source of comfort and hope that had sustained her through various challenges over the years. She had found peace with her diagnosis partly through her belief that death was not an ending, but a transition to reunion with Robert and other loved ones who had gone before. Her Catherine was particularly moved by Margaret's stories about her teaching career and the lasting relationships she had maintained with former students. Several adults in the village had been her pupils decades earlier, and they still sought her advice on important decisions or visited to share news about their families. She had attended countless weddings, baptisms, and graduations over the years, watching children she had taught grow into adults and become parents themselves. William found himself thinking about legacy and the different ways people leave their mark on the world. Margaret had never held public office or achieved fame, but her influence on generations of children had created ripples that would continue long after her death. The love and values she had instilled in her students would be passed on to their children and grandchildren, creating an impact that was impossible to measure but undeniably real. After dinner, Margaret brought out photograph albums and scrapbooks that documented her and Robert's life together. She had been meticulous about preserving memories, creating detailed records of family vacations, holiday celebrations, and ordinary moments that had taken on special significance over time. Each photograph prompted stories about the people and places that had shaped their shared journey. The couple learned about Margaret and Robert's courtship, their struggle to afford their first home, the challenges of raising children on a teacher's salary, and the joy they had found in simple pleasures like evening walks and weekend picnics. Their love story was not dramatic or extraordinary by conventional standards, but it was remarkable in its consistency and depth, a testament to the power of daily kindness and mutual respect. As the evening progressed, Margaret began to show signs of fatigue, though she tried valiantly to hide her discomfort. Catherine noticed her increasing pallor and suggested they should perhaps begin thinking about their departure. Margaret protested that she was fine, but William gently insisted that they did not want to overtax her strength, especially since they hoped to maintain contact and perhaps visit again if she felt up to receiving them. The prospect of their departure brought unexpected emotion to the surface. Margaret had clearly treasured every moment of their visit, and the thought of returning to her solitary routine was difficult, despite her general acceptance of her situation. She had prepared small gifts for each of them, handmade items that reflected her lifelong skills and creativity. For Catherine, she had crocheted a delicate bookmark, using thread that matched the roses in her garden. For William, she had prepared a small potted cutting from one of Robert's prize-winning dahlias. Carefully rooted and ready for transplanting, the gifts were accompanied by handwritten notes expressing Margaret's gratitude for their visit and her hopes that they would find happiness and fulfillment in their important work. She had written to Catherine about the challenges of balancing public duties with private life, drawing on her own experience of managing a teaching career while raising children. Her note to William spoke about the importance of finding moments of genuine connection with people, regardless of one's position or responsibilities. As they prepared for their final moments together, Margaret asked if she might say a prayer for their family and their continued service to others. The prayer was simple and heartfelt, focusing on protection, wisdom, and the strength to find joy even during difficult times. Both William and Catherine were deeply touched by this gesture of care from someone who had such pressing concerns of her own. The moment of departure arrived with a weight that none of them had fully anticipated. Margaret stood at her front door, leaning on her walking stick but maintaining the dignified posture that had characterized her throughout their visit. The evening air was cool and fragrant with the scent of night-blooming flowers from her garden, and the cottage windows glowed warmly against the gathering darkness of the Welsh countryside. Catherine found herself reluctant to leave, feeling that she had discovered something precious in this humble home that she rarely encountered in her usual royal engagements. Margaret had offered them authentic human connection without agenda or expectation, sharing her wisdom and warmth simply because she wanted to provide hospitality to visitors. The experience had reminded Catherine of why she had been drawn to public service in the first place: the opportunity to make genuine connections with people and perhaps offer comfort during difficult times. William stood quietly beside the car, watching as Catherine and Margaret exchanged final words and embraces. He had been profoundly moved by Margaret's grace and acceptance in the face of terminal illness, her ability to find meaning and even joy despite her circumstances. Her small cottage had taught him more about courage and dignity than many formal ceremonies or state occasions ever had. He realized that this visit would influence how he approached his royal duties going forward. Margaret pressed a sealed envelope into Catherine's hands, explaining that it contained additional photographs and a longer letter that she could read when she returned home. She had spent considerable time during the previous weeks preparing these materials, wanting to share more of her and Robert's story, but recognizing that their visit would be limited. The envelope also contained pressed flowers from her garden and a recipe for the Welsh cakes she had served with their afternoon tea. The elderly woman made one final request that surprised them both. She asked if they would be willing to plant Robert's dahlia cutting in their own garden and send her occasional photographs of its progress. She explained that this would give her great comfort during her remaining weeks, knowing that something from their shared garden would continue growing in a place where it would be cared for and appreciated. Both William and Catherine immediately agreed, understanding the profound significance of this simple request. Their driver Thomas had been waiting patiently, understanding the importance of allowing the farewell to unfold naturally without time pressure. He had observed many royal departures over his years of service, but he could see that this one was different, more emotionally charged than the usual conclusion of official engagements. The genuine affection and respect that had developed between his passengers and their hostess was evident in every gesture and word. As they finally prepared to enter the car, Margaret made a comment that would stay with them for years to come. She told them that their visit had reminded her that kindness and love could transcend any barrier of circumstance or position, that human connection was possible anywhere when people approached each other with open hearts and genuine interest. She said that their presence in her cottage had felt like a blessing, not because of their royal status, but because of their willingness to simply be present with her during a difficult time. The drive away from Margaret's cottage was initially silent, as both William and Catherine processed the emotions and insights from their extraordinary day. The Welsh countryside passed by their windows in the growing darkness, but their thoughts remained focused on the remarkable woman they had just left behind. They both understood that they had been changed by this experience, that Margaret's wisdom and courage had offered them new perspectives on their own lives and responsibilities. Catherine opened Margaret's letter during the journey home, reading portions aloud to William as Thomas navigated the winding country roads. The letter contained more stories about Margaret and Robert's life together, including challenges they had faced and overcome through mutual support and determination. She had also included advice about maintaining strong relationships during the pressures of public life, drawing parallels between her experience as a teacher and their roles as members of the royal family. William found himself thinking about how they would explain this visit to their children. George, Charlotte, and Louis would certainly be curious about the flowers their mother was bringing home, and the story behind the dahlia cutting that would soon be planted in their garden. He realized that Margaret's example of living with grace and purpose, despite adversity, would provide valuable lessons for their children about what truly mattered in life. As they traveled through small villages and past farms where lights twinkled in cottage windows, Catherine reflected on the contrast between Margaret's humble but love-filled home and the grand palaces where she and William carried out their official duties. Both environments had their place and purpose, but Margaret's cottage had reminded her that the most important human experiences often happened in the simplest settings, when people opened their hearts to one another without pretense or formality. The journey home became a time of quiet reflection and shared understanding. They discussed how this visit had reinforced their commitment to finding authentic moments of connection within their royal responsibilities, ways to ensure that their public service remained grounded in genuine care for the people they were privileged to serve. Margaret had given them a gift far more valuable than any state treasure, a reminder of what really mattered in life and service to others. 6 weeks later, William and Catherine received the news they had been dreading but expecting. Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep, exactly as she had hoped, in the cottage she had shared with Robert for so many years. The call came from her daughter, who explained that Margaret had spoken often about their visit during her final weeks, describing it as one of the most meaningful experiences of her last months. She had died holding the photograph of her and Robert dancing at their anniversary celebration, the same image that had captured Catherine's attention during their visit. The funeral was held in the small village church where Margaret and Robert had been married 63 years earlier. Despite their usual protocol requiring advanced security arrangements and formal notifications, William and Catherine made the decision to attend quietly, arriving without fanfare and sitting in the back pew like any other mourners. Their presence was noted by other attendees, but the reverent atmosphere of the service prevented any disruption or inappropriate attention. The service itself was a beautiful tribute to a life well lived, filled with readings from Margaret's favorite psalms and hymns she had sung with the church choir for decades. Her former students, now adults with children of their own, shared memories of her kindness and wisdom as their teacher. Her children spoke about her unwavering strength and love, her dedication to family, and her grace in facing life's challenges. The church was filled with flowers from her garden, cut and arranged by neighbors who had been inspired by her horticultural expertise. Catherine was particularly moved by the eulogy delivered by Margaret's eldest grandchild, a young woman who spoke about her grandmother's influence on her decision to become a teacher herself. She described Margaret as someone who believed in the potential of every child, who had taught her that true success was measured not by material achievements, but by the kindness one showed to others and the positive impact one had on other people's lives. Following the service, the family had arranged a reception in the village hall, where Margaret's recipes were prepared by friends and neighbors who had learned them over the years. The walls were decorated with displays of Margaret's photographs, her pressed flower collections, and artwork created by her students throughout her teaching career. It was a celebration of community and connection, exactly the kind of gathering Margaret would have loved. During the reception, Margaret's daughter approached William and Catherine with a special request. She explained that her mother had left specific instructions for Robert's dahlia cutting, which they had planted in their garden and which had thrived throughout the summer. Margaret had wanted them to know that she had received their photographs of the growing plant with great joy, and she had requested that after her death, they might consider sharing cuttings with her grandchildren so that Robert's dahlia could continue growing in multiple locations. The couple readily agreed to this request, understanding that it represented Margaret's desire to maintain connections even after her death. They arranged for their head gardener to prepare several healthy cuttings from the thriving plant, each one carefully potted and accompanied by detailed care instructions. These plants would eventually travel to gardens across Britain and even internationally, as Margaret's grandchildren had settled in various locations for their careers and families. In the months that followed, William and Catherine found themselves returning often to the lessons they had learned during their brief time with Margaret. They made subtle but important changes to their approach to royal engagements, seeking opportunities for more personal connections and authentic conversations, even within the constraints of their official duties. They began requesting less formal settings when possible, longer time allocations for individual interactions, and briefings that included more personal background about the people they would be meeting. Their children became enthusiastic caretakers of Robert's dahlia, which had been planted in a special corner of their garden, where they could easily observe its progress. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been fascinated by the story of Margaret and Robert's love, and the way their legacy continued through the simple act of sharing plants with others. The children began their own small garden project, inspired by Margaret's example of finding joy and purpose in nurturing growing things. Catherine kept Margaret's letter and photographs in a special box in her private study, returning to them whenever she needed reminding about what truly mattered in life and service. The pressed flowers had been carefully preserved and framed, creating a permanent reminder of their extraordinary visit to the Welsh cottage. Margaret's recipe for Welsh cakes became a favorite in their household, prepared regularly by their kitchen staff and often shared with guests who commented on their exceptional flavor. The story of their quiet visit to Margaret's cottage remained largely private, shared only with their closest family members and most trusted staff. They understood that Margaret had valued the intimacy and authenticity of their time together, qualities that might have been diminished by public attention or media coverage. However, the impact of that single day continued to influence their approach to their royal responsibilities for years to come. William often reflected on Margaret's observation that kindness and love could transcend any barrier of circumstance or position. This simple truth became a guiding principle in his interactions with people from all walks of life, reminding him that beneath titles and protocols, human connection remained the most powerful force for positive change. Margaret's legacy lived on not only in the plants that continued growing in gardens around the world, but in the approach to service that she had inspired in two people, whose own service would touch countless lives in the years ahead.